The Gilded Age, an 1873 Mark Twain novel that caricatured greedy businessmen and dirty politicians, lent its name to an era of great transformation, a period of gross materialism and massive political corruption. The Gilded Age was marked by the rise of a new class of ultra-rich entrepreneurs. Their wealth eclipsed anything seen before and allowed them to collect and pocket politicians by the dozen. The period was also one of extravagance and outlandish behavior. Below are 20 things about some fascinating but lesser-known Gilded Age facts. The Gilded Age was an era of great changes. Just like the rapid pace of change in our world today bewilders many, the Gilded Age was an era of massive and revolutionary changes. Railroads knitted America together. The importance of factories, mining, and finance increased by orders of magnitude. Immigrants arrived by the tens of millions, and cities and homes began to be lit and powered by electricity. Electricity had been around for some time, but it took Nikola Tesla, a Serb inventor who arrived in America with 4 cents in his pocket, to make the things that made electricity a part of everyday life. Among other things, he invented fluorescent lights, electric generators, the FM radio, spark plugs, remote controls, robots, and the Tesla coil that is used to transmit radio and TV broadcasts. Shortly after Tesla arrived in the U.S., Thomas Edison hired the brilliant but new immigrant to redesign his electrical generators and perfect his light bulb, and promised him $50,000 if he succeeded. Tesla did, but when he asked for what he had been promised, Edison laughed it off and said, "Tesla, you just don't understand our American humor. When you become a full-fledged American, you will appreciate an American joke." After Thomas Edison screwed him over, Nikola Tesla took his talents to Edison's greatest rival, George Westinghouse. Nowadays, alternating current, AC, lights up our homes and workplaces, and powers up our appliances through wall sockets. By contrast, direct current, DC, is relegated mostly to batteries. In the 19th century, however, the issue was undecided, and powerful interests fiercely competed to decide whether AC or DC would dominate the world. Tesla would decide it against Edison. Gilded Age karma. Alternating current was championed by George Westinghouse, who pushed AC as the best means to bring electricity to the masses. On direct current's side was Thomas Edison. There was serious money at stake, and Edison had cause to regret screwing his former employee over. DC is crappy when compared to AC, because DC is weaker and can only be transported short distances. However, Edison had already invested millions in DC, and he was not about to let the upstart AC flush that investment down the drain if he could help it. Unfortunately for Edison, in a bit of Gilded Age karma, the Nikola Tesla, the former employee whom he had screwed over, and in whose face he had laughed, played a key role in wrecking that DC investment. Employed by Westinghouse, Tesla basically designed the modern AC electricity supply system that ensured its easy delivery and use. That ensured the defeat of Thomas Edison and his DC plan in what came to be known as the War of the Currents. In addition to his key role in developing readily usable alternating current, a scientific contribution that revolutionized the world, Tesla had a long list of other major inventions. He had over 700 patents in 26 countries, that included X-ray devices, electric generators, electric arc lamps, fluorescent lights, spark plugs, robots, remote controls, bladeless turbines, the Tesla coil, and FM radio. Indeed, the modern world as we know it would be impossible without Tesla. As the American Institute of Electrical Engineers put it, were we to seize and eliminate from our industrial world the results of Mr. Tesla's work, the wheels of industry would cease to turn, our towns would be dark. The small town crime that gripped the Gilded Age. Not much happens in Crawfordsville, a small western Indiana town. Its main historic distinction is probably that Lew Wallace, a failed Civil War general but successful post-war writer, penned Ben-Hur, A Tale of Christ while he lived there. Crawford has another distinction: it was the site of a once famous Gilded Age scandal. It stemmed from a steamy and seedy love triangle that involved a reverend, his wife, and his lover. The main culprit was William F. Pettit, a New Yorker with rough edges from an early age. He hung out with hooligans, dabbled in crime, and eventually did a jail stint for stealing a pistol. Pettit became a school teacher when he got out, a fervent Methodist, and an unordained revival preacher. That was how he came into contact with Hattie, an older school teacher. They got married, but it was not to be a happy union. William still liked to carouse with his friends and chase women. The couple eventually moved to Indiana. There William concealed his past, became an enthusiastic Freemason, and worked his Masonic connections to get a gig as an ordained Methodist minister in 1886. He eventually ended up at Shawnee Mountain Methodist Episcopal Church in Crawfordsville, Indiana. a seedy Gilded Age reverend, and a small-town heiress. Mrs. Pettit might have thought that her husband would mend his ways now that he was a man of the cloth. If so, she thought wrong. William, now the Reverend Pettit, continued to carouse and womanize. Seedy clergymen were no different in the Gilded Age than they are today. It soon became known that Reverend Pettit pinched many of his female congregants, and liked to cop a feel every now and then. His most significant pursuit was of Elma Clementine Whitehead. She was the widowed daughter of David May Harry, a founder and patron of Pettit's church, and one of the richest men in the region. Elma was no beauty, and as one contemporary reporter put it in less than chivalrous terms, the most liberal of men would hesitate to call her attractive. However, what she lacked in looks, Elma more than made up for in wealth. She was one of Western Indiana's richest widows, that made her one of the region's most desirable women. Reverend Pettit had helped Elma's father write his will in 1888. He was thus aware that she would inherit most of his estate, valued at $40,000, a hefty sum back then. She also had a nice nest egg of her own, that she had inherited from her late husband. Open adultery that scandalized a small town. Reverend Pettit had first started to frequent the Maori's house in a quest to seduce their maid. Soon, however, he set his sights higher, and began to pursue the rich mistress instead. Elma, who was often surrounded by the whiff of scandal, was game. Her father was the local postmaster, but when he took ill, she took over his duties, and often tampered with the mail, apparently a common occurrence back in the Gilded Age. It led to an official investigation and censure. What made tongues wag even more furiously in that straight-laced era, however, was Elma's adulterous affairs. One of them was with a married publisher and editor of several regional newspapers. It was carried out so openly, with unchaperoned nighttime rides and unaccompanied trips throughout the Midwest, that it scandalized the locals. Victorian mores had crossed the pond to America in the Gilded Age, and that kind of stuff done openly was well not done. It finally ended when Elma's family threatened to do her lover, and if he showed up in their neck of the woods again, he figured that discretion was the better part of valor, and stayed far away from Shawnee Mound. The Reverend's second wife. William Pettit. He made a lucrative conquest soon after he blew into town. Within a year of his arrival in Shawnee Mound, the Reverend and Elma Whitehead had become lovers. The adulterous affair was an open secret. The duo, oblivious to or reckless of local opinion, openly traveled together, unaccompanied, all over the region. Before they returned late at night, they were also observed mooning over each other, and before long many locals had begun to refer to Elma as Reverend Pettit's second wife. Things got even steamier between William Pettit and Elma Whitehead when Hattie Pettit left town in June of 1889 for a month-long visit to an old friend in South Bend. With his wife away, the Reverend moved into the Mayharry residence, into a room across the hall from Elma's. The maid whom William Pettit had hounded before he went after her mistress heard them getting it on at night. Others observed that the duo acted intimately when they thought they were alone together. It was in that period that they reportedly hatched the plot to end Pettit's wife. The start of the plot that led to the Gilded Age's greatest trial. On July 1, 1889, shortly before his wife's return, William Pettit tried to buy some strychnine from a merchant, but it was out of stock. When he asked that some be ordered for him, something about the Reverend's manner made the merchant uneasy, and he declined. It was not a huge setback, as William had some left over from the previous summer. He just was not sure whether it was still good. He tested it on his daughter's dog, and the pooch promptly keeled over. The plot that would lead to the Gilded Age's most gripping trial was on. Hattie Pettit returned on July 12 and was gone within days. She had been poisoned on at least 3 occasions. Only her husband and Elma Whitehead fed her in that time, and witnesses reported that they fed the victim shortly before she went into convulsions. A doctor friend of William treated Hattie, the victim, suspected that she had strychnine poisoning, but thought she had ingested it accidentally. When she cleaned the cupboards a day earlier, her husband dismissed that as womanly silliness, and convinced the doctor that she had malaria, unsuspecting to the last. Hattie Pettit was grateful to Elma for nursing her. She even begged her at some point, "Don't go away. I want you in the house." Hattie Pettit passed on July 17, 1889. Only public pressure finally forced the authorities to act. Reverend Pettit arranged a hurried funeral for his wife, after which her remains were swiftly sent to her hometown for burial. Between that and the adulterous affair with Elma Whitehead, suspicions sprouted that Hattie Pettit had been poisoned. Public pressure worked in the Gilded Age just like it does today, and eventually the authorities had to act. In November 1889, Mrs. Pettit's remains were ordered to be exhumed and examined. Laboratory results revealed large amounts of strychnine in her body. Prosecutors immediately sent agents to arrest Pettit in Ohio. In the meantime, one of his fellow Freemasons and Methodist clergymen got Elma to tell him of her adulterous affair. He also got her to reveal that she had agreed to marry William Pettit 3 weeks before his wife's passing. However, Elma denied that she had played any role in Hattie's demise. Within days, the Methodist clergyman testified before a grand jury about all that Elma had told him. In January 1890, Elma pled the Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination and refused to answer grand jury questions. She specifically objected to the question, "State whether there was any talk or understanding of marriage sometime had between you and said Pettit, said talk or agreement occurring prior to the 17th day of July 1889. She also refused to answer the question, "State whether or not there was any understanding or agreement between William F. Pettit and you as to marriage after the 17th day of July 1889. The arrest of Gilded Age adulterers. The grand jury indicted Elma Whitehead and William Pettit. William was already in custody, so a warrant was issued for Elma's immediate arrest. As a local newspaper described what happened when the sheriff arrived, a cheerful fire burned on the hearth and it seemed almost sacrilege to break the pleasure of that circle with such cruel news. After discussing the weather for a few minutes, the deputy told Mrs. Whitehead he had a warrant for her arrest. The information was received with composure by herself and father. It was not until a half later, when Mrs. Whitehead had prepared herself for the cold, cheerless drive before her, that she evinced signs of emotion. Her admirable self-control gave way then, and she cried without restraint. Elma arrived at the courthouse jail, which already hosted her co-conspirator, around midnight. A comfortable couch had been arranged for her, and she was given the most commodious and cheerful, relatively speaking, cell in the establishment. Newspapers reported that she was remarkably composed, but doubted whether she had managed to get any sleep that night. The next morning, William was served with the charges. A rich Gilded Age woman who got away with a heinous act. The case of the tragic reverend's wife gripped Gilded Age America. The court granted William Pettit a continuance in March 1890. The prosecutor then sought a continuance for Elma Whitehead as well. In support of the state's motion, the prosecutor amended the charging documents to aver that 2 weeks before Mrs. Pettit's passing, her husband had proposed marriage to Elma Whitehead. She was alleged to have accepted the marriage to occur when William Pettit was left alone. As reported by a local newspaper, the prosecutor further alleged many secret conversations and much correspondence between the two defendants, and charges them with criminal intimacy, both immediately before and after Mrs. Pettit's death. The court granted the prosecution's request for a continuance. While the evidence seemed strong against William, there was widespread public doubt about whether he would get convicted. Aside from the fact that William had many powerful friends, Elma funded his defense and paid for top-notch lawyers. She was eventually released on bail, and her trial was delayed indefinitely. She immediately hit the road along with her father, and traveled throughout the U.S. for a couple of years to avoid a subpoena. William remained behind bars until the trial. The doubters proved wrong. A jury convicted the Reverend in late 1890, and sentenced him to life with hard labor. He contracted tuberculosis in prison, but even as he wasted away, he appealed his verdict, his legal bills still footed by the absent Elma. He won the appeal and was granted a new trial in 1893, but passed on the same day the ruling was handed down. Elma Whitehead, in poor health since her lover's demise, passed 5 years later. A giant Gilded Age hoax. The Gilded Age was full of cons and hoaxes. A literally giant hoax began on October 16, 1869, as workers dug a well behind the barn of William C. Stubb Newell in Cardiff, New York, and struck stone about 3 feet down. When they cleared the soil around the obstruction, they discovered a huge foot. Excitedly, the workers continued digging, and were astonished when they finally unearthed the petrified remains of a 10-foot-tall man. As news of the find spread, hundreds of archaeologists and scientists and thousands of the curious flocked to Newell's farm. There he charged visitors 50 cents for a look. Newell made no claims about the giant's authenticity, but invited visitors to draw their own conclusions. It seemed to many observant people to be a crude statue. Many more, however, saw it as proof of the Bible's assertions that giants had once walked the earth. The Cardiff Giant was actually a statue, created by an atheist named George Hull. He got the idea after a heated debate at a revival meeting about Genesis 6:4, which claimed that the earth had once been inhabited by giants. Hull bought a 10-foot block of gypsum in Iowa, and shipped it to Chicago. There he swore a stonecutter to secrecy, then commissioned him to shape the gypsum into the likeness of a man. Chemicals were applied to give the carving an aged look, and needles were used to puncture and pit its surface and make it look more weathered. Hull then shipped it to the farm of his cousin, William Newell, who buried it behind his barn in 1868. A year later, Newell hired workers to dig a well behind the barn, where they came across the buried hoax. The Gilded Age roots of the term "there's a sucker born every minute." From the first archaeologists, scientists, and other scholars who saw the Cardiff Giant declared it a fraud, however many theologians and preachers stepped forth and passionately defended its authenticity, crowds of the curious and faithful flocked to William Newell's farm in ever greater numbers. Hull, who had spent the equivalent of about $60,000 in 2022 dollars, sold his share in the Cardiff Giant to a syndicate for about $500,000 in today's money. The Giant was then moved to Syracuse, where it drew ever larger crowds. Eventually, P.T. Barnum, the Gilded Age's greatest huckster, offered the equivalent of $1 million for the find. When the owners refused to sell, Barnum commissioned his own plaster copy and exhibited it in New York City. He declared his giant to be the authentic Cardiff Giant, and that the one in Syracuse was a fake. That brazenness worked and gave rise to the phrase, coined in reference to those who paid to see Barnum's copy, that there's a sucker born every minute. Lawsuits about authenticity followed, and in the subsequent litigation, Hull finally confessed to the hoax. The court declared both giants fakes, and ruled that Barnum could not be sued for calling a fake giant a fake. A seriously deep sleeper. One of the odder Gilded Age criminal cases was described by the Court of Appeals of Kentucky in Fane v. the Commonwealth, 78 KY 183, 1879. It was a cold February evening in 1879, when a criminal defendant named Fane and a friend entered the lobby of the Veranda Hotel in Nicholasville, Kentucky. They shook the snow off their coats and sat down. Both were tired, especially Fane, who had not slept much lately because of sick children at home who kept him awake at night. It was warm inside the hotel lobby, the lights were dim, and it was not long before Fane and his friend fell asleep where they sat. Eventually, Fane's friend woke up and tried to wake Fane but could not. He went to the reception desk and booked a room with 2 beds, then sent the receptionist to wake Fane. The receptionist tried, but could not, and told Fane's friend that he thought the defendant was dead. The friend told him to not be silly, and to get on with it. As seen below, it did not turn out well for the receptionist when he got on with it. Attempts to wake up this sleepy head ended in tragedy. What followed, in the words of a court, as attempts were made to rouse the sleeping Fane, the receptionist shook him harder and harder until Fane looked up and asked what he wanted. The receptionist said he wanted him to go to bed. Fane said he would not, and told the receptionist to cease to go away and let him alone. The receptionist said it was getting late, and he wanted to close the house, and still holding Fane by the coat, the latter either raised or was lifted up. As he arose, he threw his hand to his side as if to draw a weapon. A bystander said to him, "Don't shoot." But without noticing or giving any sign that he heard what was said, he drew a pistol and fired. The deceased instantly grappled him to prevent him from shooting again, but a second shot was fired almost immediately, and a third soon followed. Fane shouted, "Howie," then rushed out of the lobby and into the street, pistol in hand. A Gilded Age sleepwalking defense. Out on the street, Fane thrust the pistol into a bystander's hand and asked him to defend him because he had just shot somebody, but did not know who. The receptionist succumbed to his wounds and Fane was arrested, tried. He was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 2 years in prison, from which sentence he appealed. The appellate court reversed the conviction. It held that the trial court erred when it refused to allow Fane to introduce evidence by medical experts of somnambulism, or that he had been a lifelong sleepwalker. The lower court had denied Fane's request to introduce evidence that he had to be watched since infancy lest he injure himself while asleep. Additionally, he had witnesses who were prevented from testifying that when aroused from sleep, Fane frequently got up frightened and resorted to violence as if resisting an assault. For minutes thereafter, he would seem unconscious of what he did or what was going around him. In conclusion, the appellate court held that what mattered was whether Fane had been unconscious, or nearly so, of what he was doing or what was being done to him. If in such a state he thought he was being attacked and so resisted an attempt to end or injure him, he should be acquitted. The belief that human actions can invite rain. For ages, humans have believed that they could invite rain. In ancient times, it was believed that battles were often followed by rain because of religious reasons. In the modern era, that belief was updated with pseudo-scientific theories that revolved around dinds of battle that shook the clouds and caused them to release their water. Serious attempts with official support from the US government were made to pursue that line of logic and try to make it rain in the Gilded Age. In 1871, former Civil War General Edward Powers wrote War in the Weather, in which he documented several historic battles that were followed by rain. Powers theorized that the din of battle agitated the clouds and caused them to release their rain. He took that premise to an extreme conclusion that came to be known as concussion theory. Loud noises could be used to force clouds to yield rain on demand, as Powers put it. If lightning and thunder and rain have been brought on by the agency of man, when bloodshed and slaughter were only intended, this surely can be done without these latter concomitants. In 1891, Robert G. Deerenforth was tasked with testing that theory. A cockamamie Gilded Age attempt to make it rain. Edward Powers and his concussion theory were scoffed at by reputable scholars and scientists. 2 decades later, however, Senator Charles B. Farwell of Illinois read General Powers' book and decided to test his pseudoscience, so he got Congress to appropriate $10,000, a sizable amount at the time, to make the tests. No legit scholars or scientists wanted to risk their reputations by associating with something so wacky, so a patent lawyer named Robert G. Deerenforth was assigned the task of carrying out the experiment. In August 1891, Deerenforth set up shop in the Texas prairie and put on an impressive pyrotechnic display. His men blasted clouds with mortars and with dynamite carried aloft by kites, trailed by balloons filled with flammable hydrogen, to add to the noise and take it up to the extreme. Deerenforth's men packed prairie dog holes full of dynamite and blew them up as well to increase the decibel levels. Unsurprisingly, the plan did not work. Undaunted by failure, Deerenforth falsely claimed that he had succeeded. His fabrications were exposed when a meteorologist, who had observed the experiment, published a scathing report about it in Nature. The Gilded Age Confederates who took their show to Africa. Confederates in Africa sounds like the start of a joke, along the lines of the one defining chutzpah as a Ku Klux Klan chapter in the Congo, while the KKK probably never established a chapter in Africa. Beaten Confederates in the Gilded Age actually did head to and fought in Africa. To be sure, by the time that happened, the Confederate States of America had been defeated and consigned to the trash heap of history, and the Confederates in question were veterans of the defunct state. Still, it was a fascinating tale. It began in 1868 when Union Army veteran Thaddeus Mott met the Khedive Ismail, Egypt's ruler, and regaled him with tales about American military advances in the recently concluded U.S. Civil War. Ismail was impressed and decided to hire veterans of that conflict to help modernize the Egyptian army. The first of them, Confederate veterans William Wing Loring and Henry Hopkins Sibley, arrived in 1870. Loring became the Egyptian Army's Inspector General, and in 1875 was appointed Chief of Staff of an army that was sent to fight Ethiopia. The defeated Southern mercenaries. Confederates such as William Wing Loring had fought in the U.S. Civil War, in part to preserve a system based on the enslavement of Africans and their descendants. A decade later, Loring was back at war, this time in Africa. He sought to realize the Khedive Ismail's dream to create an Egyptian empire in Africa that stretched from the Mediterranean to Lake Victoria, and from the Sahara to Somalia. In 1874, Ismail decided to get a start on the realization of his dreams, and ordered an invasion of Ethiopia, Egypt's chief rival in northeast Africa. In the resultant Egyptian-Ethiopian War, Egyptian columns twice set out to conquer Ethiopia, once from Egyptian-controlled Sudan, and again from the Egyptian-controlled Red Sea coast of what is now Eritrea. Each time the Egyptian forces, equipped with modern weapons and led by Western officers such as Loring, were crushed by poorly equipped but numerically superior Ethiopians. Loring played a significant role in the second failed attempt, which ended in a major defeat at the Battle of Gura in 1876. Confederate machismo led to yet another defeat, thousands of miles away from Dixie. William Wing Loring was promised command of the second Egyptian invasion of Ethiopia. However, the assignment went to an Egyptian named Radib Pasha, and Loring was appointed his chief of staff. In March 1876, an Egyptian army of 13,000 equipped with modern firearms and artillery, and an Ethiopian force of 50,000 armed mostly with swords and spears, drew near at the plain of Gura in today's Eritrea. The Egyptian commander sought to fight a defensive battle from a fortified position. It was a sensible choice, but Loring taunted Radib Pasha and accused him of cowardice for his refusal to march out and meet the Ethiopian host in an open valley. Stung, the Egyptian commander led his army out of its fortifications to offer battle in the surrounding plain. He should not have listened to the former Reb. The Egyptian army got routed at the Battle of Gura, a disastrous defeat that ended Egypt's ambitions to conquer Ethiopia. Loring, who rose to the rank of Major General in the Egyptian army, was heavily criticized. In 1878 he and other American officers were dismissed. He returned to America, where he penned his experiences in Africa, a Confederate soldier in Egypt, published in 1884.